My name is Eileen Paez, and I'm going to be discussing ethics in healthcare research, and we're specifically looking at the last century. So when we're looking at any kind of ethics, we need to keep in mind the four basic principles that guide us that we have discussed in previous topics and previous units. So things like respect or autonomy, and that is going to emphasize the principle of respecting the individual as well as respecting the individual's right to make informed consent and informed decisions about their own health, and thereby also informed consent with regards to participating in research. The second principle of non-maleficence involves doing no harm to the patient, which again, that means not accruing any harm during the research process. Beneficence is aimed at maximizing the benefits as well as minimizing the risk to any of the participants involved. And justice is ensuring fairness in the distribution of the research benefits, but also minimizing the burdens and the harms to any specific group. The first thing we're going to look at on this timeline is the Nuremberg Code, which occurred in 1947. The Nuremberg Code was established in 1947 after the Nuremberg trials, where over 20 Nazi physicians were accused of committing atrocities against those people in concentration camps under the pretense of science and research. After most of these physicians were convicted to either death or time in prison, the code was developed, and the code included 10 major principles. Of those 10 major principles, one of them was informed consent. This meant that the patient not only has to give consent, but also has to understand what they are consenting to. This was obviously not the case in the concentration camps. One of the other major principles was that any excessive suffering, either mental or physical, should be avoided. And if such a suffering occurred, that should result in the conclusion of any experiment. Again, this was not what had occurred during the times of the people in the concentration camps. Next on the timeline is the Willowbrook hepatitis studies from 1956. Children with mental disabilities that were institutionalized in the Willowbrook State School in Staten Island, New York, were intentionally given what was deemed as a small dose or a mild form of hepatitis in an attempt to track the development of the viral infection. The researchers further justified this by stating that these subjects were likely exposed to different strains of hepatitis due to the conditions of the institution. The experimenters also suggested that children had the benefit of getting immunized, and ultimately they did receive consent from their parents. However, the questions arose on, one, the consent. Children that were being institutionalized were being told by the researchers that the parents could have their children come to the institution and they would be provided medical care and would be allowed to be institutionalized, but only if they went through that hepatitis ward. And secondly, the full disclosure of the fact that the children were getting immunized was not the actual goal of the experiment. Additionally, it is questionable of whether or not any child should be used as part of an experiment regardless of the parents' consent. And the fact that the experiment was never intentionally to immunize the children and was merely an unexpected consequence of it just made it even less moral. The next stop in our timeline is on the Jewish Chronic Disease Hospital study of 1963. In 1963, at the Jewish Chronic Disease Hospital, Dr. Chester Southam decided to experiment with 22 elderly, indigent, and even debilitated individuals that were being hospitalized for other reasons. These individuals also included patients that were senile. These individuals were injected with active live cancer cells. The reason for his experiment was that he wanted to see if the immunological systems of those patients that were debilitated reacted any different to the introduction of cancer cells than people who were otherwise healthy. The issue with this study was that of informed consent. In order to ensure that patients participated, patients were not told that they were being given live cancer cells. They were only told that it was part of their treatment. Remember, these patients were otherwise hospitalized for other long-term chronic diseases. By doing so, Dr. Southam circumvented the Nuremberg Code by giving proper informed consent of not only what they were consenting to, but also the risks and benefits. Next on the timeline is the Declaration of Helsinki, which occurred in 1964. The Declaration of Helsinki was developed by the World Medical Association in 1964. It took what was already known from the Nuremberg Code and further established the rights of the patient, which included things like consent, as well as the rights to agree or disagree, and reminding researchers of the patient's autonomy. It established the fact that the risks that were being administered must be minimized at all costs. Therefore, if risk increased, either to discontinue the research or that it would need to have been modified. The declaration further went on to caution the use of any vulnerable groups, especially children and those that were disabled. It required clear research protocols. Therefore, any of the research that was being conducted needed to specifically state what was being conducted, and that had to be followed. So, for example, in the Willowbrook study, that was not the case. It required a research review board to be established, whereby people who wanted to conduct experiments would need to bring their research to a review board in order to clearly identify any potential risks. Informed consent was again one of the principles in the forefront. Additionally, privacy was added, meaning that any participants had the right to privacy or an understood right to privacy while participating in said research. Next on the timeline is the Tuskegee syphilis study, and although that technically began before the time of the Nuremberg Code in 1932, it did go until 1972. In 1932, in Tuskegee, Alabama, an experiment began to observe what would occur in patients with untreated syphilis. This experiment was exclusively done on Black men. By 1940s, penicillin became a treatment choice for syphilis. However, the people in the study were never informed of this, and penicillin was actually withheld as a form of treatment. These experiments continued until 1972. After what came out in the Tuskegee syphilis study, the Belmont Report in 1979 occurred. The purpose of the Belmont Report was to highlight the rights of the patients and the responsibilities of the medical professionals, not only treating the patients, but those that were conducting the experiments. What came out of the report further reminded us of those Nuremberg codes. Major principles included the right of the patient, including autonomy and protection of those that were vulnerable, beneficence, which included doing no harm and the benefits to outweigh the potential risk and harm, and justice, so that the benefits are evenly distributed as well to one group benefiting or not being harmed. And therefore, in conclusion, if we recall, those four major medical ethical principles are being highlighted in that Belmont report of autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice. Thank you.